This is video five of 9 in a series entitled What I've Learned in 9 Years of Marriage. Today we're talking about submission, right? Submission and marriage. I apologize in advance because this is going to be a longer video than I usually do, but this topic causes a lot of problems and I really want to talk about it deeply and thoroughly. Now, normally, when people first think of the word or hear the word submission, they think it means to dominate another person, right? They think it means for the other person to just have no free will, no individual rights. For men, some men hear the word submission and think that a wife submitting to them means that a wife does what the husband says, period. Doesn't object, doesn't disagree. I mean, those type of men are what the world tends to call the alpha men. Regardless of how repulsive that way of defining submission is, many women are attracted to those type of men. Those men seem confident, sure of themselves, right? They carry a type of charisma, perhaps a certain status. But if a woman were to marry that type of man, soon they would realize how selfish and self-centered and obsessively controlling that type of man is. Soon that woman would begin to regret the marriage and fall out of love with that man. Why is that? You ever really deeply think about that? Why is that? Well, one really clear reason is that that type of man isn't following God's design for submission and marriage. And naturally, if you don't follow God's design, it doesn't produce the effects it was supposed to have. In other words, as Maya Angelou once quoted, you don't swim on a stove. A stove was meant to be used to cook. That was the design of the stove. So, what is God's plan for submission in marriage? Well, we'll get to that. But before we do, I have to approach this topic fairly and talk about the women getting submission wrong too. Some women hear the word submission and they completely determine to never let a man tell them what to do, right? That they're independent, they say, and they're their own boss, they say. You know, only my father tells me what to do, they say. I mean, I'm headstrong, I'm confident. I need a real man to control me, to try to tame me. If you can't handle me, then maybe I'm not for you. Do you notice the rebellion? That's the opposite of submission. Some men end up being attracted to these type of women, right? They tell themselves, well, I want a woman with an attitude. At least I know not just any guy can step to her. Okay, I hear you. Or they'll find that spunk, that hood chick persona is sexy. Then that guy marries that woman, right? And soon they find how many problems that rebellion causes. Arguments over nonsense. Now, regardless of what that husband says sometimes, that may very well be for her well-being, the fact that the idea didn't originate from her mindset, from her own independent will, causes a problem. Now, let me speak for many good men out there. Let me be respectfully direct here. There is no amount of sexiness or sexual expectation that would make that type of stress worth it. Side note, it severely strays away from the Proverbs 31 woman that God called wives to be. She opens her mouth in wisdom, and the teaching of kindness is on her tongue. Does that sound like a woman that's rebellious to you? Does that sound like a woman that has an attitude? So submission, to borrow the headlines from Pastor John Piper, submission does not mean you agree on everything. It doesn't. Submission does not mean that a man or a woman does not have their own brain. Submission does not mean you cannot try to influence your wife or your husband to get what you want or need. All right? Are you following me? Submission does not mean putting your wife or your husband before God, before Christ. Okay? Are you still with me? And submission definitely does not mean living or acting in fear. It doesn't mean that. So I covered at least 6 things that submission doesn't mean. So what does submission mean? Basically, submission means that you are selfless. You are committed to the wants and needs of someone else, and in this case, your spouse. That comes before your own selfish pursuits. It's really that simple. Here's an example to help drive the point home. When a parent has a newborn, the needs of that baby comes first. That's the idea. When the baby cries in the middle of the night, you have to get up, change a diaper, or feed them. Your sleep comes second. Where do I get this from? Well, Philippians chapter 2, verse 3 to 4. Do nothing from selfishness or empty conceit, but with humility of mind regard one another as more important than yourselves. Do not merely look out for your own personal interests, but also for the interests of others. That is the truth for all of our relationships. Marriage is no different because marriage is a relationship. The world views submission as dominance. The Christian view of submission is quite different. That verse gives us the standard for all our relationships. And right now, more specifically, we're talking about marital relationships. In the words of my mentor, the man shall put the woman's desires in the forefront, and the woman lets him lead as he serves her. Scriptural leadership is never self-focused, but always a service to others driven. Mark chapter 10, verse 35 to 45. Society makes leadership about power, and unfortunately, the church has followed. Leadership is about serving others to the sacrifice of self. That is how Christ led, and that is how men are to lead the way in the home. That's what my mentor said. In other words, men are to submit to the needs and the wants of the woman. Like Jesus submitted to the wants and the needs of the church. We're called to love our wives like Jesus loves the church. That's the submission. And the wife submits to the leadership of their husband, serves him with his wants and his needs. Now imagine two people truly and selflessly thinking about the other, serving the other, as opposed to what imperfect humans typically do. What's in it for us mentality? Who says submission is a bad thing? Lessons are taught when we question our thoughts. My name's Felice Mathieu, aka Thoughts Questioning. God bless.